Yes, keep your last week's we start with, but those are new ones, so grab one of those as well. Yeah. Right. Okay, we are live according to our technicians. So let's open with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, again, we just marvel at your extreme goodness to us on a daily basis. We thank you for life, for health, for strength, for provision, for watching over us, for meeting each needs. We thank you that you are indeed a God of all of life. Every part of our life needs to be committed and submitted and surrendered into your hands, and we thank you for that. And so help us today as we continue to study in the book of Exodus, that we will realize just what a matchless God we have to serve. Help us to indeed leave this class today in awe of you, but at the same time convicted of how important it is for us to share this goodness with others so that they too can submit to you and know life eternal through Jesus Christ. So we thank you for our KBC family. We thank you for this time and look for your blessing and help now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so take out your sheet from last week. The sheets that are at that door are new ones for today that, Lord willing, we definitely need to get to later today, but we're starting with your sheet from last week. So anybody not have one of those? Anybody missing that? So you can follow along, okay. Okay, Linda, you need one, huh? Okay. So remember, this is an adult class. I use the word adult loosely. This is our adult Sunday school class. We're studying for about 5 weeks here. We're studying the Pentateuch. Do you have one of these, Lisa? Okay. We're studying the Pentateuch, and right now we are on the book of Exodus. And so this is simply continuing what we saw in Genesis. And that's why on the top of this sheet you have the several timelines, just so you can get perspective, etc., and we don't need to repeat those. But if you'll drop down to 2/3 or so of the way on the sheet, we are at chapter 3, verse 4 to 4:17. And remember the methodology I said that we're using here. It's not just a matter of we're saying, okay, first 3 chapters, we're just going to, kind of do the best we can to go verse by verse or paragraph by paragraph, but rather I'm trying to address things that I think come up as you're just reading the text, like, whoa, I wonder what about that? That seems weird, and whoa, those 3 verses, they just seem to be thrown in there. What's going on with this event? And so we're just kind of trying to handle things like that as we walk through here. So in 3:4 to 3:14 to 4:17, God is called Moses. You know the account, so we don't need to go through and relate all the individual things. But God is calling Moses, and we have Moses using what we might call multiple excuses why he's really not the one to be the leader to lead them out of Egypt. And as I think I told you last time, when you read a section like this, if you have a tendency to be hard on him, you need to be sure when you read it, you're looking in a mirror, okay? Because what we see here with Moses sounds exactly the way I'm afraid too many of us are when God calls us to a task, and our task is not anywhere nearly as great as the kind of task that God was calling Moses to perform. And what I really find interesting here is how God patiently dealt with him through this whole thing. I mean, when he gave excuse number 1, God could have just sliced him and diced him and said, you dirty individual, I saved you, and you're supposed to know me, and you're going to act like that too. No, that's not how God works. God was going to patiently deal with him. And especially when you get to like number 4, in chapter 4 and verse 10, Moses said, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since you have spoken unto your servant. I'm slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And you know what? It could really be that he did have some kind of lisp or speech impediment. Because notice, God didn't say, Moses, what are you talking about? You're one of the most eloquent people I know. You took freshman speech in college. You were number 3 in a class of 30, and you won this oratory. No, God never tried to jack him up and prop him up and say, oh, you can do it. God simply said, so what? So what if you have a speech impediment? So what if you have a lisp? Who made you in the first place? Maybe I made you with a lisp intentionally. Again, I'm reading a little between the lines because we don't know that he really had that. But you get the point I'm making? God doesn't argue with him. God simply says, so I will be with you. And if I call you to do something, isn't that sufficient? Isn't that enough for you to go ahead and do what I want you to do? Well, then finally, when we get to his fifth excuse, chapter 4 and verse 13, this is where God gets mad, okay? And this makes it evident, I think, that all through these excuses, Moses was just, as we would say, treading water. Finally, he gets to verse 5, and he gets to excuse 5, and he runs out of excuses, and he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of whom thou wilt send. Or, as I simply say, he tells God, God, I just don't want to do it. Call the person in the pew behind me. And that's when it says, notice the next verse, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Okay? That's when God got mad at him, like, okay, Moses, enough is enough. I patiently worked with you. I promised you the equipment you need to do what you need to do. But finally, the truth comes out. And God knew this all along, that was really what his whole thing was. He was going to sandbag, shall we say, for a while and hope he could get out of it. And finally, God called his bluff and said, no, I won't go for any of those excuses. I will give you Aaron to go with you, etc., but you are going to be the individual. And wow, again, there's just so much good stuff we can learn here and apply to our own lives as we read these. But like I say, don't get too tough on Moses unless the first time God asks you to do something, you just jump and say, well, Lord, I was waiting to raise my hand. I was just waiting I was waiting for you to ask me to do it. No, that's not how it is. We usually sandbag God. We usually think of all these excuses. And then finally, when we're backed in a corner, the truth comes out, which God knew all along. Okay? And then chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. See, some of you have come in a little late. We're on last week's handout. Is there anybody who doesn't have a handout from last week? The ones you got at the door, we should get to later. Anybody needs some last week's handouts? Okay, so this next one is, again, just an interesting thing, but it comes up a couple of times in the text, and some people have a moral problem with it, like, wait a minute, God allowed these people to lie and bless them for it. In effect, God told them to lie. So in chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, we find the Lord says, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass when ye go, you shall not go empty-handed, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor and of her that sojourneth with her in the house, jewels of silver, gold, etc., and you will spoil the Egyptians. Wow. Now let's face it. When God was going to lead Israel out of Egypt, did he say, go to your neighbor and ask for a dozen eggs and a pound of flour and I'll pay you back, knowing that they were leaving and they weren't going to repay a dozen eggs and a pound of flour? No. But that's not what the text is saying. It was deceitful. I think I put on your sheet there to notice the word ask, as it is in the King James Version, the word borrow in the King James Version. The New King James has the word ask for things. And that's a much better translation to use here. In other words, when the Israelites went to an Egyptian and said, I'm asking you to give me this, they had no intention of ever giving back, like they were just asking for, an egg from their neighbor, and your neighbor knows when you get groceries, you're not going to bring an egg over and repay him. They're just giving you something. The Egyptians knew that this was not a matter of just, I'll give it to you, and within 24 hours or within a week you will give it back to me. It was, I'm giving it to them, and I'm not going to get this back. And as I put on your sheet, the word spoiled the Egyptians is not the typical Hebrew word for like after a battle when you go in and just, shall we say, totally spoil them. You just rip them off of everything, and to the victors, go all the spoils. That's not the word that's used here. So this was not a lie. This was not a setup where the Egyptians thought that they were going to get something back. They knew when they gave it that they were not going to have anything given back to them in return. And when you look at the further references then that I gave you in chapter 11 and chapter 12, it specifically says that the Lord gave Israel favor in their eyes so that they would want to do it. because they were so glad to finally just get rid of the Israelites. It was like, hey, we'll give you anything. Just get out of here. And I have a sneaky feeling, again, reading between the lines, probably they were scared a little bit. I mean, when they saw everything that Israel's God could do to them, it was like, if that's all you want, take it and go. I mean, man, we could be totally fleeced before you get out of here. And so again, we have a great picture, I think, of God's sovereign working in the lives of these Egyptians so that they gladly gave it. There wasn't any behind-the-scenes something or other going on, trickery, whatever. This was very evident. So if you happen to be reading something on Exodus and they play it up, see, God tells his people to lie, but it's okay to be deceptive because you know God and they don't. No, that's not what it's teaching us at all, because that's not what happened. This was a straight-up, shall we say, a straight-up deal. It was understood on both parties. Now, chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, a very strange account, okay? It's very brief, 3 verses. It seemingly is thrown into the text like if these verses would not be here, it wouldn't change anything, okay? It's not like you've got to have them there or something doesn't make sense. The pronouns in the original, we struggle with the antecedent. Well, who is that pronoun actually referring to? So 4:24 to 26. And it came to pass, by the way, in the inn, remember now, Moses has been called, and so he's leaving the desert, he's leaving the wilderness, and he's heading back toward Egypt because he's going to be the human who's going to deliver God's people. It came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him, and the him here is a reference to Moses, and sought to kill him. Zipporah, his wife, took a sharp stone, cut off the foreskin of her son, and cast it at his feet, and said, Surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So he let him go. Then she said, A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. And the Lord said to Aaron, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, what are these 3 verses doing just interjected in here, and it's such a strange event to begin with? Well, like I said, the hymn in verse 24 is a reference to Moses, and the Lord met Moses, and the Lord was going to kill him. Now the question naturally is, why? Or maybe what, but why? What did he do? I mean, God has just called him to deliver him, and now God's going to kill him. What in the world is going on here? Well, the text does not give us a specific reason. But immediately Zipporah, who was his Midianite wife, remember, she was not a native Israelite, she was a Gentile. His Midianite wife took a knife and circumcised their son. And so it must have had something to do with circumcision. And again, without going into a lot of backstory, you remember, but circumcision God gave to Abraham as a sign of the covenant. Okay? So from all indications here, it appears that Moses had not circumcised his son. Either he didn't think it was important, or else maybe just in haste, supposedly, he said, well, there's so many other things out here in the desert to do, I don't have time to do it. Or maybe it was, and this appears that this is more the reason, maybe it was because his wife Zipporah was just repulsed by that. From her background, etc., it was like, why in the world do we need to do that? That sounds really crazy to me. Okay? And so therefore, she circumcised the son. But notice, after she finished circumcising or cutting her son, it says she touched Moses' feet with it. And some scholars actually say, because this is true at other places, that the word feet here is actually a euphemism for his genitals. And so she simply came and took that cut off foreskin, touched Moses in that particular spot, threw it on the ground, and said, You are a bloody husband to me. You say, whoa, pretty strong words here. But what is the point? The point seems to be that indeed Moses, should we say God was telling Moses, you are about to lead my people out of Egypt, and yet you haven't even done one of the most important things that a Jew does to his sons, and that is circumcise them. And you're supposed to be the leader of these people. This is a life and death matter with you, Moses. You need to do it. You need to stand up and do what's the right thing to do. And so he did it. And like as one writer says, When Zipporah says, "You are a bridegroom of blood," it cannot be understood any way other than to communicate she was derisive and there was derision and revulsion for the rite of circumcision. But Moses said, well, no, that's what we need to do, or that's what needs to be done, and she did it, but she, should we say, hated every minute of doing it. And then all of a sudden, we're just back to the old story again. But it's just interesting as God, the author here, writes, should we say, how he just throws things into the mix. Okay? Still with me on that? You see what we're talking about? Okay. Okay, go to page 2. Ray, you're looking intently on, that's for later today. We're on last week's. You got last week's? All right, I'm impressed. Good job. Okay, so let's move to page 2. And now we come to the heart of what this portion of Exodus is all about, and this is the plagues. And they were, of course, kicked into motion by Pharaoh's question in chapter 5 and verse 2. Verse 1, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Okay? Now, Pharaoh is not saying here that he has not heard of this God who is called the Lord. Okay? He would have heard the Israelites and others talking about it, etc. Remember, he lived in a land of multiple gods and goddesses, so he was used to a lot of deities. He was very familiar with that. But basically, the gist of his reply was, who do you think this foreign God is that he has the right to come on my turf and tell me how to handle my show? You know, it's kind of like athletes when you talk to them and they say, "Nobody comes to my home court and beats me. You know, we defend our turf." Well, yeah, that's okay, but they often talk big and can't live up to it, shall we say. But that's in effect what Pharaoh is saying here. He's saying, hey, I have lots of gods and goddesses who rule in Egypt. And of course, remember, the Pharaoh was basically a representation of the deity himself. And so he's saying, I call the shots here. If your Lord is a desert deity 300 miles from here, well, that's great. Go over there and let him control that piece of real estate and tell you what to do. But he doesn't come in my backyard and tell me to release you because you are my slaves. And so, as maybe some of you have even heard me say in the past, this has to be one of the dumbest questions that any human being has ever asked in history. Who does the Lord think he is to tell me how to run the show? Now, this in one sense is very similar, I think, to like Psalm 14:1 and 53:1, where both of those psalms are almost identical verbiage, and they start out where it says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, as we read that, we think, that's referring to an atheist. Really, it's not. The wording and so on is basically the person is saying God is irrelevant. The fool has said in his heart, what does God have to do with this anyhow? Have you ever met anybody like that? Did you ever meet anybody yesterday like that? Of course. People we meet all the times, basically, who are unsaved. They might not mouth it quite that way, but that's in reality what they think. Well, God's irrelevant. What does God have to do with my vacation time and praying about what I'm supposed to do? What does God have to do with my finances? I work hard and make it. What does God have to do with... And on they go. They're simply saying, God is irrelevant. God says, that's a fool. God is very relevant for everything. And that's what Pharaoh was basically saying here. God is not relevant to our situation here in Egypt because we have our own gods. In fact, you're looking at a God. So why would you try and tell me that your God is telling me that this is what you're supposed to be doing? So this is one of those classic Old Testament examples of God versus the gods, where God simply is going to enter into battle with them, and we're going to see more of this as we go through here. But I mean, when you stop and think about it, I often say, this is really amazing how God responded to him. I mean, God could have just, shall we say, blown a gasket and said, Pharaoh, you know what I'm going to do to you? I'm going to burn you crisp in a moment. I mean, he could have, because he was Lord, and Pharaoh really was making a big fool of himself. Or, I mean, God could have simply, said, Pharaoh, you need to sit down, and I'm going to give you a theological answer to your question. I'm going to write on the whiteboard 17 propositions so you understand how great Yahweh is. I mean, God could have done that. But in effect, God simply said, okay, you want to know who I am? You want to know who the Lord really is, who has a claim on your life, Pharaoh? I'm going to just roll up my sleeves, and you just stay tuned for the next year, and I'm going to show you by what I do who really runs the show in Egypt. And that's what he did, as we know, as we see with the plagues. He could have just blasted Pharaoh right out of the room, but he didn't. Should we say he patiently worked with him and gave him an opportunity to say, Yahweh, you really are greater than I am. I'm not the God in the room after all. You are in control. I bow to you. God gave him an opportunity, but he didn't take it. Actually, he simply got harder and harder and harder, because no way in the world is he going to submit to the real God when he looks in a mirror and thinks he's looking at God himself. So, that's why we have here this great battle of God versus the gods. And I love, again, as you read other parts of the Old Testament that refer to this, you go back to Daniel chapter 9, where Daniel is rehearsing some of Israel's history, etc., and he talks about this very event, and he says how on this day God got, the King James says, you have gotten for yourself renown. Literally, you have made for yourself a name, and the word for name can also, in English, we can bring it over with our English word fame. So I like to read that and say, Daniel was telling God, this was the day, God, when you became famous in Israelite history, when you started bringing all these plagues. And that's exactly what God did. God made a name for himself. He became famous. Just like you think of athletes, and they say, well, here is the reason that athlete ought to be in the Hall of Fame, because on this one key day in a championship game, he really rose to the top and he took his team to victory. And they say, wow, that's the time. Mark that down on your calendar. That's why he's so deserving of what he gets. And God said, yeah, or Daniel said, yep, this is the day God became famous. This is the day God made a name for himself, because he's going to expose, or he's going to show himself in all his godness, and he's going to expose all these cheap, plastic, imitation, handmade wannabes. He's going to say, why would you want to bow down to any of them when you can bow down to the Lord of the universe and see him work on your behalf? So, top of your handout, note all these references as you go through this section on the plagues, where it talks about God displaying his power, etc., so that they would know who he really is. So drop down about 3 lines. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. About 4 references. That you may know that there is none like me. The magician said, this is the finger of God. I mean, even his religious functionaries came to him and said, Pharaoh, this is beyond us. There is some God who is greater than us who's behind all this. You know, cry uncle, submit, give in. And what did it do to Pharaoh? Made him all the madder that these people who supposedly were in control of religion would admit it's beyond them. There's a God greater than the Egyptian deities. Okay, we continue. That you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land, that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. And so God was judging the entire religious system. Exodus 12:12 says, upon all the gods of Egypt, God executed judgment. Or if you go back to the book of Numbers, when it recounts Israel's history in Numbers 33 as they traveled through the wilderness, referring to this very event, it says, this was the day when God executed judgment on the Egyptian deities. And that was the whole point. If you're in a heavyweight boxing match, God versus the gods, what do you want to do? You want people to leave the arena that night and say, we know who's the heavyweight champion. He proved it in the arena. And God said that's exactly what it is. It's a heavyweight match between God and all these Egyptian deities. And when you leave, I want you to never forget who really is the heavyweight God of the universe, who really is the champion. And therefore, he showed it by defeating all these Egyptian deities. So, what we have here is indeed a great, shall we say, exposure of them. Notice the continued quote I put on the sheet then. This is a heavenly combat, war between the God of the Hebrews and the deities of Egypt. For the biblical writer, the whole episode of Israel in Egypt was a matter of theology. It was a question of who was the one true God, who was sovereign over the operation of the universe, whose will was to come to pass in heaven upon the earth. And then, as I say, in this connection, don't overlook the significance and irony of the rod in Exodus 5-14. And then I say, note the frequency of varied rods in Egyptian art, reliefs, scarabs, etc. Okay? You've probably seen a lot of Egyptian art, etc. And have you ever noticed, to be honest with you, I'd never really thought of that when I've seen some of that Egyptian archaeological stuff, how many times there actually is a rod in their artwork, if you will. And the more I studied, etc., I found how indeed that was to them a symbol of power. So that's why when you have all these Egyptian scarabs that a key ruler would maybe use, to impress it upon a document that this is an official document, or if you have the Egyptian king, etc., there would be a rod somewhere on that painting or somewhere on that archaeological thing, because it was his way of saying, this is my power, this is my rod. And there are actually multiple Egyptian words for different kind of rods. Now, let's keep reading here, because this is really neat. The rod was a symbol of authority, leadership, royalty, power, deific power, magical power of the gods, superhuman power. That's what the rod stood for in Egypt. Okay? So here comes Moses along. And have you ever noticed, like I said, how many times in chapters 5-14 it talks about the rod in his hand, and God says, take your rod and do this, take your rod and do that. Well, Moses' use of the simple shepherd's rod would have been insulting to Egyptian royalty and priesthood. How could a mere shepherd's staff match up with the royal staffs endowed with the power of Osiris, Osiris being one of the chief Egyptian deities? That idea underscores the theology of the Exodus writer that the real power of the universe was not in the staff, but in the God. Yahweh was victorious not because of the type of rod that was used, but by his great power and sovereignty. And again, you read and you start thinking about all this and you say, what irony that was. I mean, God could have told Moses when he initially gave him a rod, here, this rod is going to be the kind of rod that kings use. Only the top dog on the governmental pole can ever handle this rod because he has kingly power, etc. But instead, what did he have? Had a shepherd's rod, might have had some manure on it, who knows. And when he went in and did this, he didn't use a kingly rod, he used a shepherd's rod, basically the lowest rod that you could have used to perform miracles. I mean, not only did God display his power, but it's like a real smack in the face for the Egyptians, because it's, wait a minute, this isn't fair. You're not even using a kingly rod and you're being victorious over me. You're making me look foolish. But again, that's just one of the many ironies, if you will, in this whole passage, which for the Egyptians would have really stuck out to them. We just read it, a rod. Okay, he carried a rod. Well, if he forgot his rod, no big deal. No, it was a big deal. Because every time he went with that shepherd's rod and the power of God was on display, it was just like a smack upside of the head of the Egyptians. Look at this. It's not the kind of rod. It's not a kingly rod. It's the God behind this rod that is judging you and bringing all this havoc in Egypt. Wow. Wow. Can you tell I get excited about this? I mean, this is just one simple part of the Bible, but this is just incredible. This is just incredible what God is doing. Okay? And so the next thing on your sheet then is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Oh, and by the way, I guess I also put on your outline there at the very end of the plague narrative, Yahweh was victorious. But the Israelites also needed to know his incomparableness, chapter 10 and verse 2, because while they were in Egypt, they had succumbed to the allure of Egyptian deities. Now, that's not talked about a lot, or virtually not at all in Egypt, in Exodus, where we read and it says, now the Israelites really struggled with Egyptian deities, and in wholesale numbers they were losing their teenagers to Egyptian deities. No, it doesn't talk about that here. But as we keep reading Israel's history, we find out that the Egyptian deities really were tempting to the Israelites, and a lot of Israelites bought into it, or at least partially bought into Egyptian theology. Like, well, you know what, we're here, and probably their gods really are more powerful than we think, so we better kiss up to them at least some of the time. Marilyn? Okay, Marilyn's tying that in with the snake back in the book of Numbers. So, right. Use that rod for that healing? It could be, but that's a whole other interesting passage, and we'll let Pastor Phil deal with that. We'll let Pastor Phil deal with that when he does the book of Numbers in a couple of months. Yeah. Is a powerful rod. Yeah, the Moses. Yeah. Good point. Mm-hmm. You will deal with that, right, Pastor Phil? Absolutely. Okay. See, I'm telling him what to teach already. Okay, Kyle. Okay, the question is, isn't Jesus called the rod of Jesse? Can I ask why you asked that? How does that tie in with this? You can't get us off on a rabbit trail. Oh, okay. He's trying to connect the dots. Where do we find that Jesus is called the rod of Jesse? Isaiah 11, right? So is that the answer you want, or did you want a fuller? Okay, right. Isaiah 11. Okay, so next we move to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and this is also problematic, and this is one of those themes, if you will, that can be problematic, because when you hear of the hardening of somebody's heart, generally you might have a couple of thoughts immediately come to mind. Number one, you might say, well, that is not fair for God to harden his heart so that he couldn't even be saved or turn to the Lord. Or perhaps number two, you say, yeah, I know, this is the Old Testament and God is just a capricious bully. He's that playground bully who's out there looking for little kids to beat up upon, and so that's what he's doing. Well, both of those thoughts are foolishness, okay? Neither of those thoughts are correct. But this is a key thing, because as I put on your sheet, this concept occurs about 20 times over the course of this whole narrative right here, over the course of about 10 chapters. So what in the world is going on here? Well, if you chart the references, and again, we could spend a whole Sunday school lesson and more just on this, so I'm just trying to give you a real brief overview. But if you laid all this out and charted the references, about 10 times it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And the other half, it says that God hardened his heart. Okay? So right away you ought to say, well, wait a minute, this is not just God writing something in cement and saying, I'm going to dry the cement and you have nothing to do with it. No. Pharaoh hardened his own heart as well. Okay? So we've got to grapple with this and say, how can it be he hardened his own heart, but on the other hand, God is also hardening his heart? And how does all this fit into, shall we say, what we know about the character of God, etc., etc.? So, and it is interesting, you have to go about halfway through the references until it says that God hardened his heart. In other words, as you start reading this, it's constantly put in your mind, Pharaoh's hardening his heart, Pharaoh's hardening his heart, Pharaoh's hardening his heart. And finally, about halfway through, it says, and now God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So, on your sheet, I simply put some things that you do need to wrestle with as you try to come to a proper understanding and explanation. First of all, divine sovereignty and human. First of all, God is not the author of evil. Okay? So however you're going to explain it, you can't say, God made Pharaoh to sin. Because we have very clear verses that say God is not the author of evil. Okay? Number two, divine sovereignty and human responsibility. And this is something that for thousands of years theologians have debated and will debate. Okay? But God is sovereign over all events, but humans are accountable for their actions. That's simple enough. Let's just move on, okay? Yeah, you see how difficult some of this can be that we're wrestling with. But we know from the rest of the Bible, yeah, God is sovereign. Nobody does anything, and then God says, oh, no, now what am I going to do? It's shot in my plans. I'm going to need to go back and get a whole new schematic of this deal. No. But on the other hand, people do exactly what they want to do. They're accountable, and yet it fits perfectly with what God's overall plan is. Number three, God gave him numerous opportunities and he refused. Okay? But it's easy to see why he refused, as we said a moment ago, because he thought he was God or the representation of God. And for a foreign God to come in and basically say, I'm in control, I mean, wow, that would have put the foreign God one up on him, and no way that was going to happen. Okay? But just think of how often we see this kind of thing in people's lives today. When they are given an opportunity to say, I am sorry, I was wrong. Pretty simple. What do? Hair on their neck bristles, they straighten their back or whatever, and they stare at you. No way am I going to say you're right and I'm wrong, because that would prove that you are one up on me. Really? What's wrong with honesty? Right? But it's easy to see here. And as we know, what happens when you are, shall we say, working with your hands and you keep working in the dirt and rocks and everything? What develops on your hands? Pardon? Calluses. Yeah. And so with every opportunity he had to say, I am sorry, Yahweh really is Lord, He is supreme in Egypt. Every time he said, no, He is not, guess what it built on his heart? The callous. It made it that much easier the next time to say, no way am I going to bow to your God. And that's why when his religious functionaries even, should we say the top of the food chain, right under him, spiritually speaking, would tell him, this is beyond us. Give in. It just made him that much madder. The callus probably thickened twice as much on that one time, if you will, because it was nobody is going to be one up on me. And so here is God giving him an opportunity. Do we find that same kind of thing? Remember, this is the Old Testament God who's a capricious bully. Do we ever find the New Testament God saying that same kind of thing? Phil? Romans 1, what does it say? Exactly. Romans 1, people refused to acknowledge who God was, so he gave them more of the very sin that they delighted in. You say, what? He should judge them. He should remove them. They can't commit that sin. God says, no. If you're going to reject me because you love sin that much, I will just make it opportune for you to keep committing more of that sin, and all that does is builds more of a callous, more of a callous, more of a callous. And it doesn't mean that there's never any hope that somewhere down the road some radical act will happen that will pull that callous away, and even that kind of person will be saved. But it is a reminder to us, it is a dangerous thing to play games with God, because God will give you exactly what you want. And what it can do is simply harden you, make you that much stiffer, shall we say, against Him and what He really wants you to do. And so God was giving him all these plagues. Think of how many plagues, like I said at the beginning. I mean, God could have just burned him to a crisp in a second. God could have struck him with a stroke in a second at the start of all this. But he didn't. He just worked and worked and worked and worked and showed his glory, gave Pharaoh opportunity after opportunity to say, okay, you really are God. But every opportunity also became an opportunity to become harder. Number 4, God's work to soften a heart, this ties in with it, often has a contrary effect because the more opportunity God gives to refuse, because God is giving you more opportunity to refuse and you become more calloused. On your sheet, I gave you something here from Victor Hamilton in his handbook on the Pentateuch. He lists 5 ways in which God attempted to soften Pharaoh's heart. Number 1, by the prayers of Moses. Moses actually prayed for him. Number 2, by the testimony of his own magicians. Number 3, by moving him to partial obedience, where there were times when he said, okay, I will let you go, but there will still be a few stipulations on it. I mean, you read that and it's almost like maybe his heart is softening. Maybe he's getting it after all. And number 5, by continually giving Pharaoh another chance. But ultimately, as we know, he hardened his heart beyond repair, if you will, and therefore he was indeed judged. And so as I put on your sheet, consequences will always correspond to actions. God has created a moral order to the universe. His plan is so all-encompassing that even the rebellion of man will in the end be made to serve his purposes. Through Pharaoh and his hardness of heart, God demonstrated to the world that no matter what the condition of an individual's heart, God will use them to serve his purposes. And you can find Bible references there that indicate that very thing. So, a lot to chew on, okay? But boy, is that very relevant for what we see even today as God works in the lives of people. Okay? Questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions before we move on to the next simple section. Okay. Finally, we come to the plagues themselves, which were miracles or supernatural. So I gave you a definition on the sheet of a miracle. I love this definition for everything that E.J. Young reminds us of. A miracle is a direct act of God's special revelation performed by God in the external world, contrary to the ordinary course of nature, and designed to be an attestation or sign. So notice some key things that this definition reminds us of. First of all, it is an act of God. It's not just, oh, that just happens. That's just a real ordinary thing. No. Secondly, it was performed in the external world where it can be seen and experienced. Okay? It's not like God said, oh, I did something really amazing in the clouds today. And you say, oh? He says, yeah, just trust me that I really did it. No. He does these miracles down here on the carpet where people see them. Third, it is contrary to what we see in nature. It's not just the normal thing. So as you read the Old Testament or as you read books about the Old Testament and writers, etc., who with all their enlightened understanding today say, well, we know that couldn't have happened because it was supernatural. Duh, that's the whole point. It is supernature. If it would only be natural, per se, nobody would sit up and listen. It wouldn't be glorifying God in the same way. It is beyond nature. It's not what you would normally expect. And then finally, it is not just something that happens and you walk away and say that, big deal, been there, done that. No. It is indeed intended to point to something beyond itself. And that's why unbelievers have such a hard time swallowing the supernatural, because it is beyond their ability to grasp. And if they think they're God, they don't want to acknowledge there is an omnipotent God who's greater than them and can pull off greater things than they can pull off. So we should expect unsaved people to deny the supernatural. We should expect especially unsaved theologians to deny the supernatural, because they think they've got their act together and they understand God for sure. And so it's really humbling for them to say, but even as a theologian, this is beyond explanation, because God is greater than my mind. That's the whole point of it. So, as I put on your sheet, the Old Testament uses several different words for miracles, with the common nuance of extraordinariness, something wonderful, a display of power. However, the word sign indicated they were signposts, testifying to God. The miracles served to validate the true God against the claims of pagan polytheism. Exodus 12:12, against the gods of Egypt, he executed judgment, and to create within Israel the anticipation of his further victories. We'll see in a moment in chapter 15. So, the last point he made there on the Old Testament's use of the word sign for these miracles, it's because, remember, these miracles that God performed were never meant to be an end in itself. It was not a matter of God did the miracle and he said, okay, on 3, let's all say, ooh, ah. Okay, now let's get back to our daily work and just, the humdrum of life. No. These miracles were like a signpost pointing to something beyond the miracle itself. Like, yes, look at the miracle, say, ooh, ah, and then say, now what does that miracle tell me about something that's even greater than what happened? Can you think of, we'll jump to the New Testament quickly, can you think of a New Testament book that is very appropriate as we think of the word signs? Acts? What did I hear? You said John. Okay, we need a vote. We have the Acts group and we have the John group. How many is going to go with Gary and say Acts is the great book for this word sign? Have 1, 2, 3, 4, a few more, 5, 6. Whoa, hands are coming up, Gary. Whoa, maybe you need to walk around up here with a placard. Vote for Gary. Okay, who says John? About the same number. And who of you are afraid to vote because you don't want to be exposed? Okay, I'll go with John here. And why would I go with John? Not because it's Pastor Phil over Gary. Why John? Resurrection? It's okay, but it's far greater than that. Did I hear somebody over here? Christy. Well, what's given as a sign? Okay, exactly. Remember what John says as he comes to the end of his book. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of all his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might say, ooh, ah, and walk away. No. How does the verse continue? But these are written in order that you might believe what? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and what? Got to stop here, else. That you might have eternal life. And so when John records the miracles, how does he record? There are 7 miracles in John? And what is the Greek word? Well, you don't know Greek, but somebody's told you this, I'm sure. What is the word that he uses when he talks about every one of those? Go ahead, Mark, say it. Wilson's not here, so I get to pick on you. Yeah, huh? He uses the word sign. John doesn't use all these other words for miracles like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When John refers to Jesus' miracles, he says, this sign Jesus did. Because the miracle that Jesus was performing was, and even if the word sign isn't used, it still is that's what the miracle was supposed to do, point to something beyond itself. But John especially wanted his readers to get the point that when Jesus did something, it was because there is something far greater beyond it than just the razzle-madazzle, if you will, of that particular moment. It was pointing to Jesus as the Messiah in order that you might believe, and if you believe, you would be saved. And so, wow, with these miracles here that are being performed, again, God is using them to judge, but there's far more than just judgment here. God is also trying to teach them something about himself, to display his spectacular power, his grace, his love, his care. They can trust him, on and on we could go. Wow, all kinds of great stuff. Okay, so what about the time frame for these? If you drop right below the chart, one of the first questions that often comes up is, well, how long did it take for these miracles to transpire, these 10? Well, as I put there on your sheet, we are not we are not told for sure, okay? It's not like it gives us a countdown so we can figure it out. But probably, if you took them simply back to back, and where basically it says one day this came, 2 days later it was removed, and then a day and a half later another one came, and 2 days later it was removed. If you put them back to back, it's about 4 weeks long, okay? But I think it was probably, as I put on your sheet, closer to like 6 to 8 months as a minimum when you start figuring in other things like the various kinds of crops that were affected, where it says this crop was just beginning to grow, and then a little bit later in another one, and this crop was just reaching its maturity, etc. When you start looking at the whole agricultural cycle, etc., and put it together, I think it was at least probably 6 to 8 months, maybe even a little bit more than that. And I think that makes a lot of sense in the sense that, or in the aspect that this was giving the people an opportunity to repent. If it would have just been bam, 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 one after another, it's like, man, I didn't even have time to know what hit me. How could I repent? But it was like, whoa, week after week after week after week after week after week. And it's just like, when is this going to end? Well, really, that was God's mercy. He was giving them an opportunity to start putting it all together and say, enough is enough. 1 bad week is bad. 2 bad weeks is really bad. But we don't need 3 bad weeks for sure. So God, even I think in this, is giving them opportunity to repent. And then, of course, the next thing I put there is the fact that people ask the question, well, weren't these just natural occurrences? Because that's what, again, a lot of so-called theologians want to say. Well, these are just natural things anyhow. They want to deprive it of its supernatural. Well, on the one hand, yes, there was a natural element to them. In other words, the frogs, the swarms, the cattle disease, the locusts, those were all things that Israel would be that the Egyptians were familiar with. They didn't wake up one morning and say, what is that hopping across the bedroom floor? Oh, that's a Sudoku. Never seen a Sudoku before. And then they go in the bathroom. What's that? Well, that looks just like what I saw in the bed. Some more Sudoku. What's a Sudoku? No. They saw them and they said, yeah, we've seen frogs. But again, as we're going to see here, it was God using a natural thing that they were familiar with, but using it in such a way that you couldn't deny there was a miracle, that it was really a supernatural. And isn't that, when we study the Bible, isn't that what we often see? God uses something that we are familiar with, but He takes it, shall we say, up and away beyond the natural, beyond the normal, so that we realize this really was a miracle. This was supernature. Okay? So, how do we know, shall we say, that these really were supernatural or miraculous? Well, I've listed for you here four reasons that you can ponder and explore. The first one is orderliness. These were not just random, haphazard, should we say, off-the-cuff things that dealt with humans. No, they dealt with humans, they dealt with animals, they dealt with the environment, they dealt with the whole theological system. And of course, from archaeology, we know that basically in every one of these areas, there was an Egyptian deity or several deities who were over this area. And again, I could have given you a chart here, or I could have filled in the names of some deities. I do think we need to be a little bit cautious when we try and do that and say, well, Egyptian 1 most definitely dealt with this deity. Plague 1. Plague 2, it definitely was a strike on this Egyptian deity. Because remember, with the Egyptian deities, there was a lot of fluidity. But there are good books out there written by conservatives where they try and give you the names of different deities. And that can be helpful so that you realize that every one of these areas that God dealt with the miracles, every one of those areas basically had gods and goddesses who supposedly were in control of it. And so that simple statement in Exodus 12:12, on the gods of Egypt, God was executing judgment. Wow, that is an incredibly huge statement. Because, indeed, it was dealing with the entirety of the Egyptian religious scene. It wasn't like Egyptians could walk away and say, oh yeah, in these 3 areas God proved He was more powerful than our gods, but in these 97 areas Egyptian deities still ruled the show. No. You could tick off every single box. And God was showing your Egyptian deity is a cheap imitation plastic handmade wannabe. It doesn't compare to me. Okay? So there's a lot of rhyme and reason to what's going on here. There is a lot of orderliness. Secondly, prediction, both for the plague to come and to leave. So on the chart, go to that third column to the right or so where it says prediction coming, and you see the NT, the NT, the NA, etc., and look right below it where you see you see how to read that. Okay, so it's really interesting. Some of these plagues, there is no time given. God simply told Moses, okay, do this, and I'm going to bring this plague. At other times, God said, okay, I want you to announce it. I want you to go and actually announce it, and I want you to give a time that it's going to be coming tomorrow, etc. And so again, this is simply an indication of the miraculous nature. This is another indication of the miraculous nature of these plagues. I mean, when you look at it, it doesn't matter how good a prognosticator you are or anything. You just don't call these shots by luck. Okay? You don't just happen to wake up one morning as a Moses and say, I think I'm going to go to them and tell them that all their water is going to turn to blood. And then a day later it happened and you say, whew, sure glad that happened. That makes me look pretty smart, doesn't it? No. You don't just pull these off by rolling the dice. It's very, very evident that God was behind them. And what I really like is the removal column, and especially the example in chapter 8 and verse 10 with the frogs. Well, first notice verse 9. Moses, chapter 8 and verse 9, Moses said unto Pharaoh, the frogs came upon them. Verse 8, Pharaoh called for Moses and said, please pray that God will take away the frogs. Verse 9, chapter 8, verse 9, Moses said to Pharaoh, glory over me. Or, basically what he seems to be saying, because this is kind of a difficult expression, he seems to be saying, well, Pharaoh, you call the shots. You tell me when you would like me to remove the plague. I mean, wow, you talk about graciousness on God's part, right? God says, Pharaoh, I want you to know that I really am in control. So you tell me the calendar. When do you want me to remove the plague from you? And this is where I just really laugh when I read Pharaoh's response. Because if you are really afflicted with something, and God would come to you and say, Dan, when do you want me to relieve you of your migraine headache that has you flat on your back? What would you say, Dan? Right now. You wouldn't say, this is kind of neat. How about a week from tomorrow? No. You'd probably say yesterday. But when Moses gave Pharaoh the option and said, will you tell God, when do you want God to remove it? What did Pharaoh say? Tomorrow. Yeah, you know this guy's mind is shot, right? I mean, wow, he has the opportunity to call a miracle. But he wants it put off another day. He must have really loved frogs, and maybe he wanted to get more frog legs for a big party. I don't know. But he says, well, let's do it tomorrow. God says, okay, I can hold off until tomorrow to remove it if that would make you happy. Yeah. So we have prediction. Number 3, intensification. Moses stresses that these were universal, lest we think there just happened to be an outbreak of frogs, or there just happened to be a gnat problem in another city, etc. No, these were universal across the whole land. And yet, as the plagues progressed and got worse, notice how they actually went from just being a nuisance. I mean, it started out basically being a nuisance to being a real pain to hitting the wallet, and finally it hit their firstborn son. So again, God in His mercy, shall we say, was real generous in the problems He brought upon them to give them a chance. He didn't just give them one big wallop to start with. He little at a time to see if they'd get it. And then finally, discrimination or exemption. Notice on the column way over to the right where it says Goshen was set apart. There are 5 references there. 5 times it's noted, but I think probably for plague 6 and plague 8, that probably Goshen was also set apart. So in other words, after God started setting Goshen apart, from that time on, after basically the end of Plague 3, from then on, Goshen was set apart for all the rest of them. And so this was simply, once again, God's way of saying that, hey, these are my people, and I want you to realize that I am in control of these. These are not just haphazard, calamities. These are not just weather changes that just happen to come to everybody. No, I'm going to bring something that on this part it's going to hit, but it's not going to hit here. And you will see that indeed there is a God in control of all this. So, we need to conclude here, but we can say it's no wonder the Exodus event is used in the Bible as the paradigm for God's saving activity. You have a helpless people, you have somebody who looked to God, God judged the enemy, and God delivered them. And so as you keep reading the Old Testament, the writers will keep going back to this Exodus event itself, because this was really the most important event in Israel's history, because it showed that God delivers His people from the evil one. So, all kinds of application. We've made some as we go through here, but there's a lot more you can think about. Any concluding questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions? Sorry we didn't get to the handout that I had there today, so if you can remember to bring that one back next week, we'll have to pick up with that one next week. Phil? Okay. Phil has a profound question, so I need somebody to come up here and help me answer the question that Phil asks. Okay, Lord bless you.